goals of your book, Imaging the Caribbean, is to break down a monolithic concept of the area by demonstrating how it has been multiply constructed visually over the course of its history. At the same time, you describe the book as a personal and political journey to rediscover the region and inspire a united rather than a divisive political future, both within the individual territories and across the region and its expanding diaspora. Could you expand on this and tell us a bit more about how you define the Caribbean? How can we better understand this tension between its diversity, its designation as a region, and its political futures?
It's a difficult question and a handful, but one I take pleasure in answering because that's what my work has been about, trying to grapple with that. And I think, like all societies, the Caribbean is beyond definition, but at the same time, it is possible to define it in some ways. And maybe I define it in two ways, and my body of work perhaps is moving in that direction, with the two M's. First is the material component of it. There's a way in which it's both its history, its present and past political future, it's the way in which it sets itself up as well in terms of a commercial, economic space. All of that is one definition, a definition that has to do with the material lived reality of people. It has had a common history in many ways, colonialism, indentureship, struggle, revolution. That binds the Caribbean and creates that basis of regionality. There's also the geography of it. The fact it's located within the Caribbean Sea. And they are primarily island territories with similar temperature geographies. And so there's a similarity that runs through. And I think that allows us to have a sense of regionality and one idea of sameness. But at the same time, as we know, every island is different. Even within continents, areas are different. When you have islands that are separated by water, it means that people's accents are very different. They're also different because there are different groups of people who settle and form that. So there's diversity within, and that diversity can be differentiated even within territory, as for instance in Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, there's a larger Indo-Caribbean population with a whole difference here that creates a different ethnic dynamic. So you have tensions in diversity. And that tension is heightened because Indo-Trinidadians and other groups who came later than the original sort of matrix that was set up between African and European. So the tensions have emerged as who owns this space, who was the first comer, who are the newcomers. So that's one aspect of its diversity and its regionalism. I think the other one, which interests me more perhaps, because I think it's the exciting way to think about the Caribbean now, is what I call it the mythologies that we have created around it. And I think every culture needs mythology. Without that, there's nothing to build and maybe not even aspire to, but to dream about, to imagine. We think about concepts like equality, but equality is not a concrete thing. Equality is something that you, in fact, imagine and build. And without ideas, without ideologies, without mythologies, you don't know where it is going. Mythologies have to bring people together, to share commonalities, to share common belief systems. Religions tend to separate in the sense that people follow different gods, and for obvious reasons. They have different kinds of origins and so on. But when I speak about mythologies, we have different grand narratives that emerge. And the grand narratives eventually become the wisdom, if you like. We can think of, for example, the way in which Indian society, that is South Asia Indian, would have developed its Ramayana and Bhagavad Gita, stories of the Ramayana, which create a mythology about the origin and development and growth of an Indian population in the Indus Valley. The United States is also involved on an everyday basis in creating its mythology of a multicultural space, a land of democracy. What is the Caribbean mythology? I think one dominant one is a survival from colonialism and struggle. When we share that, we go come out of the day, is that celebration. I think another one is the idea that within this, that as part of a new world discovery, as the crucible from which a new world took place, that it is also the place in which we had the first new world settlement of so many people who have managed to coexist, to exchange language, to create culture, to create a dynamic culture. The third mythology, which is both used and abused, is the mythology of the Caribbean having a more sensualized, sexualized, exoticized space than anywhere else. I don't think that is true. I think what makes it true, perhaps, and makes it maybe a convenient truth for Caribbean people, is that tourism can build on it, and the tourist industry can build on it. So, as beginning to speak to your question, as it were, I want to start with those ways of thinking through the Caribbean. One of the things that I find very interesting now is the Caribbean is not just a geographical space that's confined to the Caribbean. People like yourself who are second generation, I think you're second generation, are part of that Caribbean. And what people outside of the physical space are doing, that becomes very much part. But one of the earliest kinds of ways in which I began to think through the question is, for instance, the presence of Edna Manley in Jamaica. Edna Manley was trained in the UK. She's a cousin of Norman Manley, who was Michael Manley's father. Norman became the first Prime Minister of Jamaica. He married her, and they came back to Trinidad, to Jamaica. And then it was because of her work and her interest in the arts and her defining almost a space for Jamaican art, like a figure like the Negro roused. Very much of it was rooted in the idea of framing a nationalism. So I think the roots of where women's politics lie, women's politics can be formed, is a very important route to follow. I can't do justice to it because I would have to follow it systematically. Unfortunately, too many studies by women who want to study art has been about how women have been depicted rather than how women have traced different developments. I was thinking of the way in which female artists now, because we are making films and because some of the women I know, like Michelle Mohammed in Canada, who talks about the sugarcane women in sugarcane and so on, you are beginning to get definitions, you're beginning to get ideas about women art. But there's a whole body of work out there that is waiting to be done and waiting to be tapped by scholars like yourself.
I really like what you were mentioning about the two M's, so materiality and mythology. And that seemed like an interesting point of departure to think about then what you see as the role of visual art in contributing to making this sort of unified future possible for the Caribbean.
One of the reasons why I think visuality is important and the visual construction is that in the past, how the Caribbean was framed through a visual lens was not owned by Caribbean peoples themselves. Much of this for maybe 200 to 300 to 400 years would have been done by others, outsiders, who began to invent their own readings of what they saw. And I think the 20th century in particular began to offer Caribbean people both the technologies as well as the training, as well as the possibility to begin to define their own aesthetic and their own ways of seeing. So if the 20th century was also an age in which film became the dominant art form, the age in which film, the visual media, began to take hold of a global imagination, so that by the 21st century we actually read more visual images, we relate more to the visual. Every time we pick up a cell phone, even though we are looking at writing, we are already holding a visual image in our hands. Then what it means is that we have to use that to rewrite those images, and we have the capacity to do it now. The technology allows it. I think that is the primary way that the visual can be reconstructed. But in doing that, I want to take that back to the question I raised about mythologies. In mythologizing the visual, how the Caribbean represents itself is important. It is a crucial part of its own cultural sovereignty. And there is a need for visual intelligence on the part of the people who are doing that. And perhaps what we still are working at, not just the Caribbean but elsewhere, is how do we develop that visual intelligence so that we can, in fact, reshape those images. I mean, if I think of a particular example, let me think of one. When, for instance, I remember in my book, Imaging the Caribbean, I looked at two artists and the way in which they treated the quote-unquote Negro head. And one was Isaac Belisario, and another one was, I've forgotten his name, a Trinidadian visiting artist. I remember his name soon. And the figures the faces are exaggerated, the lips are exaggerated, almost caricaturish. The coloring, the entire way in which the figure is presented, the human figure is presented, is by an outsider or by somebody who's looking at it with a European lens, represents someone who somehow exists on some continuum closer to the primitive. And then the Cuban painter, again I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry, a Cuban painter that I looked at, he, in the 20th century, began to draw these images of African slaves. And he invested, his name is Douglas Perez Castro, he invested the image and the face with not just character, but the beauty. The lips were there, the eyes were there, the faces were similar, but the kind of beauty he imposed on it, the way in which the stances were, the direct look at the painter, all of that changes the way in which you begin to present people. And I think the idea of the visual is how do you shape and change that way of seeing and that way of presenting people.
referring to artists and academics of color, Winter writes that, quote, our liminal status as filmmakers and intellectuals provides us with a cognitive advantage, which parallels, in new terms, that of the lay intelligentsia of Renaissance Europe. Are we on the cusp of a kind of Caribbean Renaissance? And what are your thoughts on how we might help those liminal voices that she refers to gain greater exposure within the Academy?
I think that question of whether we are on the cusp of a Caribbean Renaissance has to take me back to that first question we raised about Caribbean mythologies. And perhaps this is another mythology, but it's a necessary mythology, because I think one has to believe and imagine the possibilities of something, and you have to sell it. I mean, we live in a very commercial world, and your idea has to be sold. So if you can find grounds to make that obvious or palatable to others, then you're already creating something out of the imaginary. But I think it is also premised on a certain truth and a certain idea of trying to remember that the Caribbean is 500 years old now. And the process of mixing, blending, putting people together, that early experiment of multiculturalism, early neural experiment, I would say, because it has happened all the time. Every civilization has gone through that. Every society has gone through this blending and mixing. But what the Caribbean offered at that time is these new coming together of different groups with totally different cosmologies and large amounts of people, not just minor amounts. When Africans were shipped over, I mean, this was the largest migration of one group to another space in a short time, both to the Caribbean and to the United States. When Indians came from who brought as indentured laborers, this was the first largest diaspora of Indians out of India. And again, 500 years ago. And then there were all these mixtures. And then add to it the fact that when Europeans were part of the West Indies or the Caribbean, they didn't remain unchanged by the process, So you were constantly changing Europe as well. What gives rise to a rebirth, which is what Renaissance is? What is a Renaissance about? I think a Renaissance has to be how elements of newness are invented, how you find mythologies, you find aspects that allow for rebirth. So the Botticelli painting is the one that signifies that. And it begins to signify spring, and it takes all the old allegorical things, elements, but it puts them together differently. But it also comes at the moment when there's an invention of when oil and paints are beginning to be part of the new media that is available to show that Renaissance, to demonstrate and not only allegories, but to demonstrate the fact that they are myths, they are their traditions. What is the Caribbean presented with now as part of that Renaissance? The new digital age. It is now democratized in a way that you, me, young people in this room, we all have the capacity. What we have to have is imagination to take it to places that others can't. And you take that imagination from the funds of your origins, of your traditions. And those are new ones. They're not the old, tried, tested, tired ones. So I think what we're saying about the Renaissance is what new ways of presenting data are there, and how might we present it so that we get people into conversations with each other, so that we don't build up the old hierarchies, that we see each other, we allow each other to be seen. I think, for instance, the business of how we can look at news now, and you can to switch on the channel and look at world news all over. You can know what is happening in Afghanistan one day and, South Africa at the same time. All of these things have changed our ways of coming to terms with reality and seeing reality. Now, that brings you back to the primary question, and you can cut all the rest of this I'm rambling, but it brings back the question you're asking, which is the Caribbean liminality creating a space for Renaissance? I find that a lot of that is coming from the diaspora. And the fact that the Caribbean has created a diaspora of people who can now look back and who want and who look with different lens and who are interested in what we who live in the Caribbean maybe take for granted sometimes, and who need to delve into stories, but they come to it differently. They come to it with a new lens again. And so this dialogue between the Caribbean and its diaspora, and its extended diaspora, because not just people who have been born in, but people who have wanted to experience the Caribbean vicariously. I think this is perhaps one of the things that might be leading to that. The other one I think has to do with the fact that the Caribbean has produced very valuable thinkers whose work makes sense to a contemporary global culture, the way in which we have to think about culture. Stuart Hall, as the father of cultural studies, came from Jamaica. Fanon, who's used widely, Sarah James, all the names, Amy Césaire. Césaire's line, which I always love so much, exchange is like oxygen to culture. It's such a short line that says it all. These have been important, and these are important, I think, to the kinds of theorizing and kind of thinking that we are moving to do. So maybe what we are saying is that the Caribbean, as a place where different cosmologies, different philosophies were brought into contact with each other, and where that divide could not take place, has allowed for a breakdown, a whittling away of binaries. So somebody like me, who I'm rooted, I had a Western education. I'm totally rooted, but I grew up under Islam. I rubbed shoulders with Hindus. I delighted in Hinduism as a performance culture. I've been exposed to African religions. I've absolutely loved being able to travel in all the islands. The richness of that kind of experience and the openness to pull that into your worldview is already prescience of the new world we have to enter. And I think that is where Sylvia Winter and I am both consistent.
How do you view your work as a filmmaker in light of Winter's call for cinematic production? And how would you compare your views on film and the visual arts in general to Winter around the question of genre?
I'm a great fan of Sylvia Winter, as difficult as she is to read. And I agree that she is an artist, because only an artist can take all these different levels of thinking and somehow meld them together. Her references I find very interesting because they're called from so many areas. What she's doing in a textual sense is what cinema does at level of montage. The theory of montage is putting things together so they tell a story, and you can take two things that are seemingly opposite. Now, they don't have to go together, but somehow when you place them one next to each other, they begin to tell a story. And Sylvia Winter has that amazing capacity to pull from so many sources and to still keep an argument going. Now, one of the interesting things she did with the 1492 debate, I think, is use that moment when we were still in 1992, when we were still talking about it as moving away linguistically from discovery to encounter, which is encounter between two places, allowing the humanity of those who were discovered to at least be reinstated, that they existed. And then Winter goes beyond that. She says we have to conceive of another definition, if you like, of man and humanity, which is beyond this business of encounter and discovery, another conception of man. And in it, she begins to draw on other disciplines, linguistics, biology. So she's reconstituting man, not as rational man, as the Enlightenment constructed, but man who is composed of other aspects and other elements. Now, I draw on that because she's disembodying man from the rational man. And so she's allowing for that text to then find another way of being, another representation of man. And therefore that is where cinema or the cinematic text becomes valuable. Because the move into virtual reality allows other possibilities. In a sense, what Sylvia Winter is doing, and I'm trying to do, is to move us away from this binary opposition in which we think of ourselves there. How can we do that in the future? And how can the cinema help to do that? Now that is where I think the cinematic text allows the possibility. So for instance, if we move it away from the cinematic text that is about the actors and move to virtuality, the way in which animation has already allowed possibilities to consider, all the ways in which animation, young kids are now learning how to conceive of difference. When I look at the way in which race and class and power and so on are being structured for a younger audience, they are learning different messages. And I think how we imagine and how we are able to take that imagination into the cinema, into the film, into a film that allows us to experience different possibilities. Because one of the important things about film is that it is emotive. You don't, you relate to a film with feeling. We talked about the pulling in the acoustic, the visual, the body. It is, your senses are alight, and you have to embrace it. So it has, for me, it has the capacity to move us beyond what the text can do. And I think, I would like to think that this is along the same lines that Winter is moving with that particular goal, and which is why I got involved in film. And I've been establishing a series of different imagination for that reason. One of the ways I think I've begun to use cinema and the film, if I started by being more didactic and wanting to, tell a story or convince or change people's minds about a way of seeing, I think I still am trying to do that. All filmmakers want to do that. You want to influence people, you want to entertain people, you want to, pull them into your world as well. But I think in those films, I began to realize that what the screen represented for me was a big canvas. And a big canvas that I wanted to paint on, but now it offered the possibilities of painting with sound. So I'm heightening the senses. It's not just a flat canvas, which, as Clement Greenberg says, a painting is a paint splashed on a flat surface. Now I have a canvas that allows me sound. But what is interesting, I'm again coming back to breaking out of that binary opposition. If history has been configured with this chronology of linear time, what film does is that it breaks up the notion of time. So you can shift around things. You can have in one film something that goes from past into present. You can put the past and present together. You can juggle around so many things. And that possibility allows for the brain to think in ways that perhaps we are now developing. Developing new potential, new ways of consciously pushing our brains to move into intelligences that we didn't know we possess.
It made me rethink what a documentary is. You're documenting something real and important, but you're also orchestrating it.
Well, I think by the time I was doing Cody Pink and Green, it not only was it a difficult film for me to make because it was the one that was perhaps too close to me and therefore difficult. But when I did start to make it, the thing that I wanted to riff on the most was the fact that what constituted the notion of India and the Caribbean, of India, is the Bollywood. And at that time as well, so Bollywood films are like a story hung together with sequences of dance and music. And then, but I was doing it at a time when the music television video was also part of our reality. And I thought, how can I make the longest music television video? And Cody Pink and Green is a visual poem and is an MTV video, and it is a riff on Bollywood, and it is a history package, and it's an open-ended discussion that young girls, and an open-ended dilemma that young people still find themselves in, because I was speaking to a younger population, and it is about questions of culture.
Blood red and milk, the essence of pink. Leaf green and gold, the enchantment of bling. Like a purple rain from an orange sky into nylon pools, forever dry. The colors of my soul, an unconscious stream.
The necessity for us to understand that culture changes, that all tradition flows like a river. It's Clifford Geertz, the idea of the river as a metaphor for culture. And all of those elements are built into that one. 17 Colors in a Sitter is, again, my love story with art. But in that one, I was actually doing something more complex for me. I was trying to put together Western sensibility, or what is seen as a Western sensibility of painting, with an Eastern sensibility and an Eastern acoustic of sound. I was putting together two different artists. In fact, all of it emerged so naturally to show how there were some similarities in the process of producing art, and that art had so many synergies. There was a writer who sits to write is doing the same thing. I find writing is very similar. But I was actually trying to maybe confront the binaries of East and West in the two art forms. And there's a point at which I know that I'm not sure whether it is successful, because I tend to have to explain this. But I think there are possibilities there for working at binary deconstruction. I think I'm constantly groping at it, and I was trying to do it again through art and music and sound and so on. And there's a little bit in it which brings in the aspect of creolization, because the group Tricanal enters. I love Tricanal. They're a very progressive group of not so young men again, and so they enter in this space, and we want to turn the whole upside down. And it is this space of creolization where, and interesting enough, Tricanal have worked with me and Rex Dixon, and they work closely with Morgan Patesa. So they're part of that creolization process of art and music in the Caribbean, and in Trinidad in particular. And I think what we're saying about the Renaissance is what new ways of presenting data are they, and how might we present it so that we get people into conversations with each other, so that we don't build up the old hierarchies, that we see each other, we allow each other to be seen. I think, for instance, the business of how we can look at news now, and you can switch on the channel and look at world news all over, and you can know what is happening in Afghanistan one day and, you know, South Africa at the same time. All of these things have changed our ways of coming to terms with reality and seeing reality. Now, that brings me back to the primary question, and you can cut all the rest of this because I'm rambling, but it brings me back to the question you're asking, which is the Caribbean liminality creating a space for Renaissance? I find that a lot of that is coming from the diaspora. And the fact that the Caribbean has created a diaspora of people who can now look back and who want and who look with different lens and who are interested in what we who live in the Caribbean maybe take for granted sometimes, and who need to delve into stories, but they come to it differently. They come to it with a new lens again. And so this dialogue between the Caribbean and its diaspora, and its extended diaspora, because not just people who have been born in, but people who have, you know, wanted to experience the Caribbean vicariously. I think this is perhaps one of the things that might be leading to that.
Do you have any upcoming visual projects that you're especially excited about?
I'm so excited about my new project. I can't contain myself. It's actually, we were talking about the senses and the breakdown of mind and body and the way I work. And I think projects come to me. It is as if they find me through whatever strange process. And when they find me, I get obsessed and I can't leave them alone. And this project came to me out of filmmaking, but also out of wanting to make a film that was not documentary, but was carrying forward a lot of the ideas that I started to develop, especially in the last two films. And I also wanted to make a film that did not relegate, that didn't forget history, that brought history into the contemporary. So I wanted to make a film that was a narrative film about something that connected. And one of the things, so I started with this idea of wanting to make another film and write a film script, a narrative film fiction. But then when I started to think about it, I realized that in order for me to script a film, just like Imaging the Caribbean, I had to actually understand the whole thing. I had to understand each character. I had to live them. I had to breathe them. I have to, know what the story is inside out, so I could then direct it and then configure everything. I had to imagine each scene. I remember over this summer looking at in Britain. I was there for 3 months, just trying to rest and work. And I was listening to Ian McEwan, a writer that I really like. And he was saying when he's writing a book, he writes almost as if he's writing for the camera. And I think as a writer, I probably write it because everything I write, I envisage. I envisage a reader or an audience immediately. All writers do that anyway, but I envisage the visual output. So I decided I was going to write it as a novel first. Again, bringing together my love of literature and wanting to play with language and to test my capacities again, to test my senses and to challenge myself. So my next project is, and I've started it, is my novel. I won't give it away, and of course it's set in the Caribbean and in Trinidad, but it moves. I'm not even located only in the Caribbean. I'm pulling the characters from London, from Ireland, because I want to. The Caribbean has been such a geographically open space, and the population have come from all over, and I want to bring that in together. And when I'm finished with that, I want to make it into a narrative film. So that's where I'm going.